They didn't come for Ginevra. They came to make Luca bring me.
She didn't plan to be noticed that night. Cara Bellini had spent 6 years learning how not to be noticed. She knew which tables to approach from the left, so the angry ones couldn't reach her easily. She knew how to smile without showing teeth when a customer spoke to her like she was furniture. She knew how to absorb insults and keep walking, keep moving, keep the plates balanced and the wine flowing, and her face arranged into something that looked like serenity even when her hands were shaking. Bella Rosa was a good restaurant. That was what people said. White tablecloths, candles that cost more per hour than Cara made in one, a wine list that required a separate menu. The kind of place where men in suits brought other men in suits and nobody looked twice at the woman refilling their water glasses because she was simply part of the room, like the wallpaper and the soft jazz and the faint smell of garlic and money. Cara had worked there for 6 months and she understood her role completely. She was efficient, invisible, and reliable. She showed up on time. She memorized every dish on the menu in English and Italian. She did not complain about the double shifts or the shoes that left blisters or the fact that 3 years after her mother died, she was still paying off medical debt that arrived in envelopes with red lettering that she filed in a shoebox under her bed. She did not mention the shoebox to anyone. She did not mention the debt. She did not mention her mother because mentioning her mother still required a kind of bracing that she had not mastered and was not sure she would. She was 26 years old and she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. That particular Friday evening started like every other. The reservation book was full. The kitchen was running hot. Rosa, who worked the station beside Cara and had been there long enough to develop opinions about every regular customer, handed her a fresh apron and said nothing, which meant things were already complicated. The trouble arrived at table 11. His name was Mr. Hargrove. Cara had served him before. He was 71 years old, a retired school teacher from Brooklyn, who came in once a month, always ordered the same pasta, always left a tip that was twice what it needed to be, and always said thank you. When she set down his plate like he meant it. He had kind eyes and hands that had gone soft with age, and a hearing aid in his left ear that he sometimes forgot to adjust when the restaurant got loud. That night, the restaurant was loud. David Marsh, the floor manager, was a man who had been given a small amount of authority and had decided it was everything. He was 34, broad-shouldered in a way that was more width than strength, and he ran the dining room with the particular cruelty of someone who has never been challenged and has therefore concluded he is unchallengeable. He had been watching Mr. Hargrove struggle with the new digital menu system for 3 minutes before he walked over. Cara saw it happening from across the room. She moved toward the table, but she was too far away. By the time she got close enough, Marsh had already raised his voice. He said something about the tablet and the QR code and the way other customers managed just fine. He said it loud enough that the tables nearby went quiet one by one, like candles being snuffed out. Mr. Hargrove's face did something complicated. He was trying to apologize and explain at the same time, his hands moving over the tablet screen, his hearing aid buzzing with feedback from the noise his whole body arranged into an apology for existing in a way that made Cara's jaw tighten. Cara stepped forward. She said calmly that she could take Mr. Hargrove's order the traditional way, that the restaurant had always accommodated that preference, that it was not a problem. Marsh turned to look at her. Then he put his hand on her shoulder and pushed her sideways, not hard enough to leave a mark, hard enough to move her out of the way, hard enough that she had to grab the edge of the service station to stay upright. The wine glass on the edge of the station rocked but did not fall. The room was very quiet. Mr. Hargrove looked at Cara with an expression that was worse than anger. It was embarrassment, the kind that belongs to someone who has been the cause of trouble when all they wanted was a quiet dinner and a familiar plate of food, and perhaps someone to say good evening to them like they were worth the greeting. Cara straightened. She did not rub her shoulder. She did not look at Marsh. She picked up her notepad and she pulled a pen from her apron pocket, and she asked Mr. Hargrove in a voice that was steady and clear and carried further than she intended what he would like this evening. The door opened. She did not look up immediately. She heard it the way you hear weather changing, a shift in the air pressure of the room, the way conversations at the nearest tables dipped and then stopped in a sequence that moved from the entrance inward like a stone dropped in water. She finished writing down Mr. Hargrove's order pasta, the same as always, extra bread on the side, and she thanked him and turned. 4 men had come in from the cold. They moved differently than other customers. Not rushed, not casual, deliberate in a way that used up the available space around them without seeming to try. The host was already guiding them to the corner booth, the one with sight lines to both entrances, the one that regular customers sometimes requested for the view, and powerful men always requested for different reasons. The man at the front was the last one Kara looked at because something in her understood instinctively that looking at him directly required a decision. He was perhaps 40, dark hair not quite long enough to be careless, a face that had been arranged by its experiences into something controlled and imprecise, and a jaw that was set, eyes that moved across the room in the kind of systematic sweep that people only develop when they have spent years being the most dangerous thing in a given space. He wore a dark suit with no tie, and his hands were visible at his sides, which she would only later understand was deliberate. Not a posture of openness, a statement of what was not being concealed. His name was Luca Severino. She did not know that yet. Rosa appeared at Kara's shoulder and spoke very quietly. She said the corner booth had just become Kara's section. She said good luck. She said it the way you say good luck to someone boarding a plane during a storm, as a gesture of solidarity rather than a prediction. Kara smoothed her apron, picked up 4 menus, and walked over. The table was already in conversation. The 3 other men were talking rapid Italian, the kind spoken by people who learned it as children in kitchens rather than classrooms, the kind where words compress and elide, and a foreigner would catch perhaps 1 in 4. Luca Severino sat at the head, listening more than speaking, his attention moving between the room and the table with a kind of parallel awareness that made Kara think of a chess player running 2 games at once. She set the menus down and introduced herself and asked about water. One of the men, the one sitting to Luca's right, glanced at her and then looked away and said something in Sicilian dialect. His name was Aldo, and he said it with the lazy dismissiveness of someone who has decided what a person is worth before they have finished speaking. He said she was pretty enough for a waitress, and that pretty waitresses never lasted long in Little Italy, that they either got smarter or got married, and either way they disappeared. He said it as a casual observation, the way you comment on weather, as though she were weather. He said it in Sicilian because he was certain she could not understand. Kara had been standing with her pen above her notepad. She did not change her posture. She did not look at Aldo. She kept her eyes on Luca Severino, and she responded in Sicilian, not the textbook Italian-adjacent version that gets spoken at language schools in Manhattan, but the real thing, the guttural compressed vowels and swallowed consonants of a dialect that most people under 50 in Sicily itself no longer speak correctly, the dialect her mother had used every night as she fell asleep every morning over coffee, every Sunday afternoon, in the kitchen of their apartment on Mulberry Street until the apartment got quiet and stayed quiet. She said in Sicilian that she had heard everything he said and that she would still bring him excellent service tonight because that was her job, and that she hoped the evening would be worth his time. The table went silent. Aldo opened his mouth and then closed it. One of the other men actually leaned back in his chair, which was its own kind of comment. Luca Severino set down his water glass. Very slowly, he looked at Kara with an expression that was not surprise exactly. It was something older than surprise, something that arrived in his face the way a door opens in a house that has been closed for a long time, letting in air that carries a smell you recognize before you can name it. He asked in Sicilian where she had learned to speak it that way. She told him her mother was from Palermo, that she had spent summers there as a girl, that her mother had believed very strongly that language was the only thing nobody could ever take from you, and so she had given Kara that language the way other mothers gave jewelry or photographs as something to carry forward into whatever came next. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked where in Palermo. She told him. Something shifted in his face. Not enough that the other men would have noticed. Just a fraction of a degree, a realignment the way a compass needle moves when it has been turning slowly and then finds a north and stops. He told her in the same dialect that the neighborhood she had described was 3 streets from where he had grown up. He ordered, without looking at the menu, sparkling water, the Barolo. If they had it, the burrata first, then whatever the kitchen was proud of tonight. He said it with the authority of someone who has made 1,000 restaurant decisions and found the menu itself to be mostly theater. Kara wrote it down. She thanked him. She walked back to the service station and her hands were completely steady, and she was not sure why that surprised her. The dinner service continued. She brought their courses. She poured wine without being asked. She answered three more questions from Luca in Sicilian: small things, the origin of a particular olive oil, whether the pasta was made fresh that morning, what she thought of the fish. Each time he switched to the dialect, it felt like a door being opened, a choice being made, and each time she answered in kind, she was aware of making the same choice back. This was not nothing. In the language they were both speaking, nothing was nothing. The other men stopped talking when she approached the table. She noticed that. She noticed also that Aldo had gone careful in a way that people go careful when they have made an error they cannot take back. He drank his wine and said very little, and avoided looking at her directly, which was its own form of apology, though not one she was obligated to accept. Near the end of the meal, Luca asked her one more question. He said, "Do you have somewhere to be after your shift?" She told him she always had somewhere to be. He nodded like that was the correct answer. He pulled a card from the inside pocket of his jacket and placed it at the edge of the table. He did not hand it to her. He left it for her to pick up or leave, which she understood was also a choice and which she appreciated for that reason. She picked it up on her way to clear the next course. On the front it said Luca Severino and a phone number. Nothing else. No title, no company name, no description of what he did or who he was. On the back, written in ink that was still faintly wet, were 7 words. "My mother needs someone like you. Call." She put it in her apron pocket. The check came. He paid in cash. The tip was more than her rent. She stood at the service station holding it, and Rosa came and stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Rosa said, "Do you know who that is?" Kara said she did not. Rosa told her, "Not everything, but enough." Kara found out about David Marsh on Monday morning when she arrived for her shift, and Rosa told her. She stood at the service station holding her apron and listened to Rosa explain that Marsh had been let go Friday night, that the owner had called him personally, that no reason had been given, but that the envelope of cash left with the check for the entire restaurant's dinner service had apparently contained a note that the owner had read alone and not discussed with anyone. Rosa said she had not read the note. Kara thought about the card in her jacket pocket. She thought about Mr. Hargrove ordering his pasta the same way he ordered it every month and saying thank you when she set it down, because he was a man who had not forgotten that courtesy was a form of respect. She thought about the weight of a hand on her shoulder pushing her sideways, and about the quality of silence that had followed 4 men through a door, and about a table that went quiet when she answered in a language she was not supposed to know. She put on her apron and said nothing and went to work. She walked home that night through streets she had walked 1,000 times, and the card was in her jacket pocket, and she kept her hand around it the way you hold something that has weight without being heavy, something you are not sure yet what to do with but are not ready to put down. She did not call that night. She did not call the next morning. On Sunday, 3 days later, a different number appeared on her phone. A woman's voice, old or warm, in the particular way of women who have cooked for decades in kitchens that mattered, and who have learned that warmth is not softness, it is something more durable than softness. The woman said her name was Ginevra Severino. She said she understood they had a mutual connection. She said something that Kara had to ask her to repeat because it seemed impossible. She said, "Your grandmother and I used to make bread together on Via Molino." Kara sat down on the edge of her bed. Via Molino was not a street she had mentioned to anyone in New York. It was a narrow street in a specific neighborhood in Palermo, where her grandmother Filomena Bellini had lived for 60 years, and where Kara had spent the summers of her childhood smelling bread and sea salt in the specific dusty heat of a Sicilian afternoon. It was a street that existed in her memory as a place of safety, the kind of safety that belongs to childhood before you understand that safety is not a permanent condition. She asked Ginevra how she knew that name. Ginevra said they had a great deal to talk about. She said she was making Sunday lunch and that Kara should come. She said it the way you say "come home," which was not something Ginevra had the right to say, and which landed in Kara's chest anyway, like something she had been waiting to hear for 5 years without knowing she was waiting. The address was in Queens, a neighborhood that had been Italian for 3 generations, and showed it in the window boxes and the saints above the doors and the smell of sauce that started on Saturday morning and ran into Sunday afternoon. The house was modest, the garden immaculate, the window boxes full, despite the autumn cold, the kind of care that happens when a place is loved by someone who has time and intention and believes that a maintained garden is a form of statement about how you intend to live. Kara rang the bell. The woman who opened the door was 68 years old and small, and carried herself like someone who had decided at some point in her life that she would not be diminished and had held to that decision through everything that came after. She had steel gray hair and dark eyes, and when she saw Kara, she made a sound that was not quite language and pulled her inside before Kara had finished introducing herself. The kitchen smelled like the inside of her grandmother's house. Not similar, the same. The same exact convergence of olive oil and tomato, and something older underneath some mineral note that belonged to a particular way of cooking, learned in a particular place and carried forward by memory and repetition across an ocean and 40 years. Kara stood in the doorway and could not move for a moment. Ginevra was already at the stove talking, her hands moving between a pot and a cutting board without looking the particular efficiency of a woman cooking in her own kitchen who has cooked in that kitchen so many times that her hands know the distances by memory. She talked about the food, about the sauce, about a specific brand of tomatoes that she could only find at one store, and how the owner always held a case for her because they had known each other for 30 years. Then she turned around and looked at Kara properly. She said, "You look like her." Kara asked who. Ginevra set down her spoon. She said, "Philomena, your grandmother. You have her eyes and the way she held her chin when she was trying not to show what she was feeling." Kara had not thought about her grandmother's chin in years. She thought about it now. The slightly lifted angle of it, the compressed quality of the jaw, the expression that was not stubbornness exactly, but was in the same family. She had been told she had it herself. She had never known where it came from. She asked how Ginevra knew her grandmother. What followed was not a simple story. It was the kind of story that takes a long time to tell because it is made of decades and because the person telling it is choosing carefully what to include. Understanding that the shape of a story determines what the listener understands, and that the listener, in this case, is someone who will need to understand correctly. Ginevra and Philomena had been neighbors, and then friends, and then something closer than friends, which does not have a clean word in English, in a building on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in the early 1970s. They had been young women together in a city that was going through its own difficult years, and they had helped each other in the way women help each other when nobody else is paying attention. Small things and large things and a few things that could not be spoken about in public. They had lost contact in 1979. Kara asked why. Ginevra was quiet for a moment. She chose her words the way you choose footing on uncertain ground, each step considered before the weight is committed. She said it had been necessary to protect each other, that sometimes the safest thing two people can do for one another is to disappear from each other's lives completely so that no one can use one to find the other. Kara waited. Ginevra said she would explain more in time. She said it was important that Kara know first how much Philomena had meant to her. She said when her son had come home 3 days ago and told her about a young woman who spoke Old Sicilian in a restaurant in Little Italy, she had known immediately. She had known because the only person who still spoke the old dialect the way it was meant to be spoken with that particular vowel and the second syllable of certain words that people from Ballarò used, and no one else was Philomena Bellini, and anyone she had loved enough to teach. She came around the counter and took Kara's face in both hands and looked at her for a long time the way you look at something you have been hoping to see and had convinced yourself you might not. Then she said, "Welcome, Figliola. You are very late, and I am very glad." Kara understood the word. In dialect, it meant little daughter, and it was the exact word her grandmother used, in the exact inflection, and Kara had not heard it in 5 years. And she did not cry. She had gotten very good at not crying, but she stayed inside Ginevra's hands for a moment longer than was necessary, and Ginevra seemed to understand this because she did not move. They made pasta together that afternoon. Their hands moved differently but toward the same understanding, the way musicians from different regions play the same traditional song, each with their own accent, but arriving at the same notes. Ginevra corrected Kara's grip on the rolling pin with 3 words in a demonstration. Kara showed Ginevra her grandmother's technique for cutting the specific angle of the knife, and Ginevra closed her eyes briefly like she was hearing something she had not heard in decades and was allowing herself the full experience of hearing it. Luca arrived an hour into the cooking. He did not knock, which meant he had a key, which meant this house was a place he came when he needed something that could not be found in his own apartment. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at Kara the way a man looks at something he was not expecting and is deciding what to do with the fact that it is there examining it from the inside rather than displaying the examination. Ginevra did not look up from the pot. She said, "Sit down, Luca, and stop hovering." He sat. The three of them ate together at the kitchen table, and the conversation moved between English and Italian and sometimes Sicilian, following the thought rather than the language. And Kara noticed that when Luca spoke the dialect, he became slightly different. The control in his voice loosened by a millimeter, the way a man relaxes a held breath without deciding to the way a place that has become safety produces a different quality of stillness than a place that is merely familiar. After lunch, Ginevra disappeared to the back of the house with a precision that suggested she had been planning to disappear at this exact moment for some time. The dishes were still on the table. Ginevra left dishes on the table, which told Kara she was not expected to clean them up, which told her this was not a test of any kind. Ginevra had simply decided her presence was no longer the most useful thing she could provide. Luca poured more coffee. He said she called you figliola. Kara said yes. He said she has not called anyone that in 30 years. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. The particular silence of two people who have acknowledged something without naming it, who have understood that naming it would change it and are not ready for it to change. Luca said he wanted to be direct with her. He said he had a proposition that had nothing to do with the card he had left at the table, which had been impulsive, which was not something he typically permitted himself. He said his mother ran a small restaurant 3 blocks away that was less a restaurant than a gathering place for the neighborhood, and that she had been struggling with the physical demands of it since her hip surgery the previous spring, and that she needed someone she trusted. He said the dialect was part of it. He said his mother's customers were old enough to remember when everyone in the neighborhood spoke the old language, and not many of them were still around. And she was trying to hold something together that was becoming very difficult to hold, a tradition that was losing the people who had carried it and had not yet found the people who would carry it next. Kara asked why he was telling her this instead of his mother. He said, "Because my mother will want you to say yes for you understand what it involves. I prefer you to understand first." She asked what it involved. He said, "My family has a complicated history. The restaurant is legitimate. The work is simple, but being around this family is not simple. There are people who mean us harm. There have always been people who mean us harm. If you come into this house regularly, you may become visible to those people in ways you are not currently visible." She looked at him across the kitchen table of his mother's house, with the smell of Sunday sauce still hanging in the warm air, and the pasta dishes still on the table, and the sound of the city outside doing what the city does, indifferent to anything that happens inside the buildings it contains. She said, "I grew up with nothing. I have been visible to dangerous people my whole life. Landlords, creditors, men who decide what women are worth. I am not afraid of being seen." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The pay is better than Bellarosa." She said she would think about it. She thought about it for exactly the time it took to walk home, which was 11 blocks. And by the time she reached her street, she had already decided that she would not call until the following morning, because she had learned early that the speed at which you give people what they want determines how they treat you afterward. People who receive what they want immediately treat it as something ordinary. She wanted to be something he would have to wait for, if only by a few hours. She called at 9 the next morning, and Ginevra answered on the first ring and said, "I knew it would be you. Come Tuesday. Come hungry." What Kara did not know, walking home through the October streets with the card in her pocket and her grandmother's face in her mind, and something that felt dangerously like hope moving quietly through her chest, was that she had already been noticed. Not by Luca Severino, who had noticed her 3 days ago in the restaurant and had been thinking about her since, with the unsettled focus of a man who is not accustomed to being unsettled and is therefore unsure what to do with the experience. By someone else. In a parked car on a side street half a block from Bella Rosa, a man had been watching the restaurant door since 9 that evening. He was perhaps 30, fair-haired in a colorless way, with the kind of stillness that is not calm, but suspended a wound spring, waiting for the mechanism to release. His name was Rowan Voss, and he had been in New York for 11 days after 10 years in cities that were not New York cities, where he had spent a decade becoming the kind of man his father would have needed. His father's name had been Carter Voss, and Carter Voss had been powerful in this city until he was not. Until Luca Severino had spent 10 patient years taking apart everything Carter Voss had built stone by stone, alliance by alliance, until there was nothing left that Carter Voss could point to and call his own. And then Luca had taken apart Carter Voss himself with the same patience, the same precision, the same absence of noise that made him more frightening than men who announced what they were going to do before they did it. Rowan had been 18 when it happened. Luca had looked at him, this boy in his dead father's house, and had made a decision that was either mercy or miscalculation, depending on how you counted the years. He had sent Rowan away with enough money to start somewhere else, and a warning that coming back meant dying here. Rowan had taken the money and the warning, and he had gone, and in the decades since he had thought about Luca Severino every single day. Not with anger exactly, with the focused attention of a craftsman studying a problem that has not yet been solved and will not be solved by anything as imprecise as anger. Anger was a noise. Rowan had learned that noise was how you announced your position before you were ready. He had come back not to attack, to dismantle. He understood what Luca had never fully understood about Carter Voss, which was that the man's real weakness had never been his enemies. It had been his inability to see that the most dangerous threats come from inside, from the people standing close enough to know the address, from the ones you had stopped examining, because trust in the end is the decision to stop looking. Rowan had spent 11 days finding the inside. He had found Aldo Luca's cousin, who had a secret that was older than Rowan's grief and heavier, and who had been carrying it long enough that the weight had made him weak in the places where it pressed. The specific weakness of a man who knows something he should have told and did not tell, and has now lived with that silence so long that the silence itself has become the thing he is protecting. He had found that Luca's one true point of stillness in a life of motion was the house in Queens and the small woman in it with the steel gray hair. And now, watching the restaurant door, he had found something else. He watched Cara Bellini walk out of Bella Rosa and turn toward her apartment, and he opened his phone and typed a message to a contact that had no name. The message said, "She is close to him now." Wait. He put the phone in his pocket and watched the spot where she had disappeared for a long moment. He watched it the way you watch a space that something important has recently vacated, understanding that the importance has moved, but the location retains its meaning. Then he started the car. He was in no hurry. He had learned patience from the same decade that had taught Luca Severino ruthlessness, and he was prepared to be as patient as the situation required. He had waited 10 years. A few more weeks was nothing. A few weeks was the difference between moving and moving correctly. The lily would come later, when the time was right. White lily, the flower from Carter Voss's funeral. The one Rowan had held at 18 years old in a cemetery in New Jersey, while Luca Severino's men watched from the tree line to make sure nobody caused trouble. He had been 18 years old, and he had stood in the rain holding a white lily and looking at a casket and understanding that the world had just revealed itself to him in its actual nature, which was nothing like what he had been told it was. He had kept one petal pressed in a book for 10 years. He was done pressing petals. Cara Bellini had walked into the Severino house because of a language her grandmother had given her, and a grief that had kept her looking for home in the faces of strangers. She had no idea what she had walked into. She had no idea that the quiet warmth of hope in her chest was now a target. She would find out. And when she did, the question would not be whether she was strong enough to survive it. The question would be whether the people around her were strong enough to deserve it. The restaurant that Ginevra Severino ran was called Osteria Nonna, and it seated 22 people on a good night, which meant a night when all the tables had been pushed close enough together that the regulars could lean over and steal bread from each other's baskets without being impolite about it. It was 3 blocks from the house on a street that had been Italian for so long that the asphalt itself seemed to remember it. The shop signs faded to a particular shade of red that existed nowhere else in the city, the way certain things take on the color of the place where they have stood long enough. Cara started on a Tuesday morning. Ginevra handed her an apron that had been washed so many times the strings had gone soft, and gave her a tour that lasted 40 minutes and covered not just the kitchen and the storage and the schedule, but the history of every regular customer, their orders, their families, their losses. The ones who needed to be seated near the window, because they were lonely and liked to watch the street, the ones who needed to be seated away from the door because they were cold and would never say so. An old man named Basilio, who always ordered the same wine and always said it was better than last time, which was not true, but which Ginevra accepted as a form of loyalty. A woman named Connie who came every Thursday and always asked whether the bruschetta had garlic because she was allergic and always ordered it anyway because she was not allergic. She simply liked to be asked about. Kara wrote everything down. By the third day, she had stopped writing things down. By the end of the first week, she understood that this place was not a restaurant in the way that Bella Rosa had been a restaurant. Bella Rosa had been a performance. This was something else. This was a place where old men came to remember what it felt like to be understood, where the food was a medium for something that had no other medium left, where speaking the old dialect over a bowl of pasta was an act of preservation that nobody called preservation because it was just Tuesday. Ginevra watched her work with a quality of attention that was not inspection. It was recognition, the particular recognition of someone who has been hoping to find a specific thing and has now found it and is checking quietly and carefully to confirm that it is in fact the thing and not something that merely resembles it. On Thursday of the second week in the slow hour between lunch and dinner prep, Ginevra sat Kara down at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and told her about the sauce. Not the recipe, the history of the recipe. How her mother had learned it from a woman in their building who had come from a village outside Agrigento and who had carried the recipe in her memory across the Atlantic, the same way she carried her mother's rosary as the one thing that could not be confiscated by the voyage or the new country or the years that accumulated in a new language. How Ginevra had watched and memorized from the age of 6. How she had made it every Sunday for 50 years in 3 different kitchens on 2 continents. How the recipe had changed in small ways each time it moved, picking up something from each kitchen it passed through. The way a language does, the way anything does that is carried by people through time. Kara listened. She said, "My grandmother has a sauce like that. Different, but the same kind of thing." Ginevra looked at her over the coffee cup. She said, "I know." She said it quietly and then was quiet herself for a moment, turning the cup in her hands, choosing the next thing carefully. Then she said, "There is something I need to tell you. I have been deciding how much to tell you, and I have decided to tell you more than is comfortable because you deserve to understand where you are standing." Kara waited. Ginevra said, "Your grandmother and I lost contact in 1979 because something happened that made it dangerous for us to know each other. I have never told Luca the full reason. I have let him believe it was simply the kind of distance that happens between people over time. It was not that." She set down her cup. She said, "In the late spring of 2012, Luca's father, Enzo Severino, was killed. It was arranged to look like a natural death. Those of us who knew the family understood it was not. What fewer people knew was that someone inside the family had provided the information that made it possible. Not an outsider, someone Enzo trusted. Someone who knew the house, the routines, the address where Enzo would be that night." Kara said nothing. Ginevra said, "Your grandmother was in New York that spring. She was staying with a cousin in the neighborhood, working briefly as a seamstress in a building on the Lower East Side. She had no involvement in what happened, but she saw something. A meeting in a service stairwell. 2 men who should not have been meeting. A name she recognized. An address exchanged between them. She wrote it down because Philomena has always understood that the things you write down are the things that survive. She kept those notes because she believed they might one day matter." She looked at Kara with the directness of a woman who has spent too many years being indirect and has decided to stop. She said, "I believe that day has come, because the man who has returned to the city is not here by accident." Kara said, "Rowan Voss." Ginevra looked at her. She said, "Luca told you about him." Kara said, "Enough." Ginevra said, "Rowan Voss is not like his father. Carter Voss used force. Rowan uses information. He finds the thing a person cannot afford to have found, and he applies pressure to it until it breaks. He has been doing this in other cities for 10 years. He is very good at it. He is patient in the way that only people who have been waiting a long time know how to be patient. And he has come back here, which means he believes he has found something worth using." She looked at Kara. She said, "I think he may have found something inside this family, and I think Philomena's notes may be the only way to understand what it is." Kara was quiet for a moment. She looked at her coffee. She thought about her grandmother's apartment, the shelf of notebooks above the small desk, the handwriting that was cramped and meticulous. and which Kara had always assumed was letters never sent, the private record of a private life. She said, I will write to her. Ginevra said, do not tell Luca yet. I know that feels wrong. But Luca will move before he understands, and moving before you understand is how men like him make mistakes that cannot be undone. Let me decide when to tell him. Kara said, and if Rowan moves first. Ginevra said, then we tell him immediately, but not before. Kara agreed. She went home that night and wrote the letter by hand. She wrote to her grandmother in Sicilian, careful and specific, asking about the notebooks, asking whether among them there was anything from the spring of 2012 related to a family named Severino, or a meeting in a specific building that Ginevra described to her. She asked her grandmother to send whatever she found. She asked her to keep it between them for now. She sealed the envelope and mailed it the next morning before her shift. Luca began coming to the restaurant more often after that second week. He did not announce his visits. He appeared in the way that men appear in places they consider safe, without ceremony, finding a table in the corner, or standing in the kitchen doorway talking to his mother while Kara worked around him. And he was always dressed well, and always watching everything, and always in some portion of his attention watching Kara. She noticed. She noticed in the specific way of someone who has learned to be precise about what they observe, because precision is a form of protection, and because noticing things that other people miss has been useful her entire adult life. He did not make it obvious. That was what she noticed most. Another man in his position would have made it obvious, would have used the fact of his attention as a kind of pressure. Luca used it differently. He asked her questions about the food, about the regulars, about what she thought of a particular wine he was considering adding to the menu. He listened to her answers with the complete attention of someone who has been listened to poorly his whole life and has therefore decided to make listening a discipline, a practice, something he does actively rather than passively. One evening he stayed after the last customers left and sat at the bar while she cleaned, and they talked for 2 hours. She asked him about his father. He told her. On the version she suspected he told most people, which was the version with clean edges and justifiable anger. He told her the version with doubt in it, the version where a 28-year-old man inherits an empire he was not prepared for and spends the next decade making decisions that were necessary and terrible, and sometimes both at once, and lives with those decisions in the specific way of someone who cannot undo them, but is trying to understand what they add up to. He said, I have spent 12 years trying to build something I would not be ashamed of. I am not finished. I am not sure I will ever be finished, but I am still trying, which some days is the best I can offer. She said, what does building something you would not be ashamed of look like to you? He said, my son, if I have one, walks into a room and does not have to explain or defend what his father did to be there. She looked at him. She said, that is a good answer. He said, it is the only answer I have managed to earn. She understood then in a way that was physical before it was intellectual, that this man was not what he appeared to be from the outside, which was a thing made entirely of control and danger, and the particular authority of someone who has never had to ask twice. He was a man who had been shaped by grief into something hard and was now late trying to find out if there was anything softer underneath worth preserving. She understood it because she recognized it. She had been doing the same thing for 5 years. The night Rowan Voss came into the restaurant, Kara was alone. It was a Wednesday late, the kind of quiet that settles into a kitchen after everyone has left and the surfaces are clean and the dishwasher is running its final cycle. Ginevra had gone home an hour earlier. The last customer had been gone for 40 minutes. Kara was going through the reservation book for Thursday when she heard the door. She looked up. He was smaller than she had expected, which was the first thing she noticed, and stiller, which was the second. He stood just inside the doorway in a gray coat, and he looked around the restaurant with an expression that was not quite appraisal and not quite nostalgia, but somewhere between the two, the expression of someone visiting a place that represents something to them without being a place they have any right to represent. Then he looked at her. He said, you must be Kara Bellini. She said, we are closed. He said, I am not here for the food. He walked to the nearest table and sat down without being invited, which told her several things. She kept her distance. She kept the counter between them and her hand near her phone, which was visible on the counter to her right. He said, I have been following your story with interest. A young woman from nowhere finds her way into the Severino house in 3 weeks. That is not coincidence. That is either luck or intention, and I do not believe in luck. She said nothing. He said, Luca Severino killed my father. You may know this. He did it methodically and completely, which I actually respect. He is a thorough man. But there is a question he never answered, a question I think you may now be in a position to help with. He said, ask him who gave my father the information that got his father killed. Ask him why, after 12 years and all his thoroughness, he never found the answer to that question. Ask him who made the first call. Then he stood up and took something from his coat pocket and set it on the table nearest the door. A white lily. He said, I am not here to hurt anyone. Not yet. I am here because information properly placed is worth more than violence. I thought you should know that. He left. She stood in the empty restaurant and looked at the lily on the table for a long time. She did not call Luca. She sat down on the stool behind the counter and she breathed and she thought. She thought about what Ginevra had told her about the spring of 2012 and the person inside the family who had provided the address. She thought about Rowan Voss saying the question had never been answered. She thought about the letter she had sent to her grandmother 2 weeks ago, which had not yet received a reply. Then she thought about Ginevra. She looked at the clock. It was 11:43. She called Ginevra's number. Ginevra answered on the second ring, which meant she had not been asleep. Kara said carefully, I think you should not be at the house tonight. I think you should go to your sister's. Ginevra was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, how long do I have? Kara said, leave now. She heard movement, the particular efficient sounds of a woman who has had to move quickly in the night before and remembers how it is done. She heard a door. She heard a car. Then Ginevra said, I am out. Tell me tomorrow. Kara said, I will. Go. She hung up and looked at the lily again. She put on her coat. She locked the restaurant. She walked the 3 blocks to Ginevra's house and stood across the street for 20 minutes in the cold. At 2:17 in the morning, a black car moved slowly down the street and stopped in front of the house. 2 men got out and looked at the house for a long moment, the way men look at a place they expected to find occupied and are recalibrating. Then they got back in the car and drove away. She watched the car go. Then she walked home. Luca was already calling when she woke up. Not her. He was calling Ginevra and then his own men, and then he appeared at the restaurant at 7 in the morning before she had unlocked the door, and he stood on the sidewalk with his hands in his coat pockets and his jaw set, and something in his face that was not quite controlled, the expression of a man who arrived, prepared for a conversation, and is having to restructure it around new information. She let him in. She made coffee. She told him everything, all of it. What Rowan had said in the restaurant, what Ginevra had told her 2 weeks ago about 2012, the letter to Philomena, the car at 2:17. When she finished, he was very still. He said, my mother told you this and did not tell me. Kara said she told me because she thought you would move before you understood. She was trying to protect the investigation. He said, there is a person inside my family who gave Carter Voss the information that got my father killed. And my mother has known there might be such a person for 12 years. He said it without inflection, which was worse than anger, because it meant he was holding something very large, very carefully, and had not yet decided what to do with it. Then he said the first call. Rowan said the first call. Kara watched him. He said there is only one person who would have had that access in 2012. Someone inside the organization. Someone I trusted completely. Someone I have not examined because examining him felt like the one thing I could not survive finding. She waited. He did not say the name out loud, but she saw it arrive in his face like a verdict he had been postponing for years, arriving now, not because he had sought it, but because the time for postponing it was over. He said, I need to know what is in Philomena's notes before I do anything. Do you understand what I am saying? I need to know before I move. She said the letter may take another week. He said, then we wait a week. The meeting of the 5 families was something Kara had heard referenced but never seen organized in real time. And watching Luca do it over the course of a single afternoon was like watching a man play an instrument that looked nothing like an instrument. He made phone calls. He sent messages. He consulted with men who arrived and departed from the restaurant with the careful casualness of people who have learned to be invisible in public spaces, who have made an art of occupying rooms without appearing to occupy them. By evening, there was a meeting scheduled for Thursday night. He asked her if she wanted to be there. He asked it the way he asked most things, as a genuine question, without the answer already embedded in it, which she had learned to recognize as unusual, and which she had come to value the way you value anything that is unusual in a good direction. She said yes. He said, "You do not have to speak. You can observe." She said, "I will speak if I need to." The meeting was held in a private room above a restaurant in Carroll Gardens that smelled of old wood and expensive wine, in the particular concentration of men who have been in rooms like this many times and have learned the specific etiquette of such rooms, which is not so different from any other formal etiquette, except that the consequences of getting it wrong are different in kind. 5 men sat at a long table, each of them with 1 or 2 men standing behind them, like topography. Luca sat at one end. Kara sat beside him, which several of the men registered with expressions they managed to keep brief but not entirely absent. The man across from Kara was named Salvatore Greco. He was perhaps 65 and had the particular authority of someone who has never had to raise his voice because the room has always known to be quiet before he speaks. He looked at Kara with an assessment that was not entirely respectful and said to Luca that he understood the circumstances, but that protocol suggested the conversation should be confined to principles. Kara did not look at Luca. She said in Sicilian, speaking directly to Greco, "You set this protocol yourself at the meeting of November 1987 in this same room which you called to address the murder of a man's wife in her own garden. You said at that meeting that the rule of this council is that civilians do not pay for the conflicts of men, and that any man who brings violence to a woman who has no part in the business has broken the oldest law we carry. You said those words. I know because the man who recorded them that night was a neighbor of my grandmother's, and he told her what was said, and she told me." The room was quiet. Greco looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You speak the old dialect." She said, "I was taught it by someone who believed it mattered. I was taught that the words said in that language carried weight because they were meant to last. I am asking you to honor the weight of your own words. Ginevra Severino is 68 years old and she has never held a weapon in her life. Sending men to her house in the night is not the action of men who honor what you built." Greco was quiet for a long moment, the kind of moment that is not hesitation, but consideration. The deliberate pause of someone deciding how to respond to something that has shifted their position without their permission. Then he said, "She speaks the old tongue and she knows the old law." He looked at Luca. He said, "The complaint is valid. We hear it." What happened next was an hour of careful, deliberate language among men who had spent their lives learning to say things, precisely committing to nothing extra, leaving no edge unguarded. By the end, there was agreement that Rowan Voss had violated protocol by moving against a civilian, and that the council would formally recognize the complaint, which meant Luca had the standing to act with collective authorization rather than unilaterally. It was as these things went, a significant victory arrived at through the only language that room respected, which was the language of precedent and the weight of words spoken long ago by men who were no longer alive to be asked whether they had meant them. Kara understood this because Luca explained it to her in the car afterward, quietly looking straight ahead as he drove. He explained it the way a man explains something to a person he has decided to trust completely, without simplification or apology for the complexity. Then he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." She said, "I only said what was true." He said, "Most people only say what is true when it is easy. You said it in a room full of men who were watching to see if you would flinch." She said, "I have been saying difficult things in difficult rooms my whole life. I just usually do not get thanked for it." She was looking out of the window when she said it. She did not see his expression, but she heard the small sound he made, which was not quite a laugh and not quite grief, and was somehow both the sound of a man recognizing something in another person that he had thought might not exist. The thing she had not told him yet was sitting at the far edge of her awareness the entire evening. She had seen it during the meeting. Aldo, Luca's cousin, sitting 2 chairs down on the same side of the table behind Luca's left shoulder. He had a phone in his lap under the table, which was not unusual. Men in these rooms always had phones in their lap. But twice during the meeting, during the moments when the discussion reached its most significant points, she had seen the screen illuminate briefly and seen his thumb move in the quick, decisive motion of someone sending rather than receiving. She had said nothing then. She said nothing in the car. She held it the way she had learned to hold things that needed to be carried carefully without squeezing, without shaking until she understood exactly what she had in her hands and what it meant and what the responsible use of it required. She needed to be sure. She was almost sure in the way that a woman becomes sure of something she has been watching from a distance for long enough that the pattern has become undeniable, that the shape of a person's behavior finally matches the shape of a conclusion she has been reluctant to reach, because reaching it means something she is not ready for it to mean. Aldo had been Luca's closest family for 12 years. She understood what it would mean to be wrong about this. She understood also what it would mean to be right and stay silent. The confirmation arrived on a Tuesday morning, 9 days after the meeting, in a plain white envelope with a Sicilian postmark. She recognized her grandmother's handwriting on the front, the careful cursive that had always looked more like architecture than penmanship, each letter built to hold weight. She took the envelope to the back of the restaurant before she opened it, standing near the prep counter, with the kitchen sounds around her, the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday beginning indifferent to what was being opened in it. Inside was a letter from Filomena, in Sicilian. 2 pages, the handwriting slightly less precise than she remembered the handwriting of a woman who was past 70 and whose hands had begun to carry time in them. The letter said that she had received Kara's request and that she had understood it and that she had looked through everything she had kept from those years. She said she was glad the notes had finally found a purpose. She said she was glad it was Kara who was asking and not someone she did not know. In the envelope behind the letter was a folded page. The paper was not old. It was dated spring of 2012, and Kara recognized immediately that this was the year Luca had said his father died. The handwriting was precise and unhurried, the handwriting of a woman who had learned to record things accurately because she understood that memory alone is not evidence, and evidence is what the future requires. Filomena had been in New York that spring, staying with a cousin in the neighborhood, working briefly as a seamstress in a building on the Lower East Side. In her careful Sicilian, she described what she had witnessed: 2 men meeting in a service stairwell on the 3rd floor, a conversation she had overheard while completing an alteration in the hallway above, a name spoken, an address exchanged. She had not understood its full significance until weeks later when she read the news. She had written it down because Filomena Bellini had always understood that what you do not write down is what disappears. She had written the name down and kept it for 12 years. The name was Bruno Ferrara. Aldo was 38 years old. In 2012, when Enzo Severino was killed, Aldo had been 26. Bruno Ferrara had been Enzo Severino's most trusted lieutenant and closest companion, the man who had helped build the organization across 20 years, and who had helped Luca dismantle the Voss network in the years after Enzo's death, who had sat across from Luca every week for a decade while they worked, who had held the ledger and made the calls and stood at Enzo's graveside in the rain, and wept in the way that men weep when they have no other language for what they feel. Bruno Ferrara had died of a heart attack in 2016, 4 years after the work was finished. He had been given a funeral that Luca organized and attended. Luca had mourned him. And Aldo, settling his father's estate 3 years after Bruno's death, had found his father's own written record of what he had done. A confession his father had written and hidden the compulsion of a man who could not live without acknowledging what he had done, but could not live with acknowledging it to anyone who mattered. Aldo had told no one. He had carried it. And Rowan Voss had found out because Rowan Voss had spent a decade learning to find the things people could not afford to have found. Kara stood in the kitchen with the page in her hand. She thought about what Ginevra had said. Let me decide when to tell him. She thought about Luca's face when he had said, there is only one person I have not examined because examining him felt like the one thing I could not survive. He had been wrong about the person, but he had been right about the feeling. She folded the page back into the envelope. She put the envelope in the inside pocket of her jacket. She finished the Tuesday prep. She worked the lunch service. She waited until 2 in the afternoon when Ginevra was resting in the back and the restaurant was empty. Then she called Luca. She said, I need you to come to the restaurant. Just you. I have something you need to read. He said, how bad is it? She said, it is what you suspected. The person is not who you suspected, but the weight is the same. He arrived in 20 minutes. She put the envelope on the table in front of him and sat across and watched him read. He read it once, then he put it down and looked at the wall, then he picked it up and read it again. When he put it down the second time, his hands were very still on the table. She had learned to read his stillness. This was the stillness of something structural. giving way inside a person, not dramatically, not with noise, but in the way that old foundations move slowly, irreversibly, reordering the weight above them in ways that cannot be undone. He said, "Finally, Bruno." She said nothing. He said he built this with me. After my father, he sat across from me every week for 10 years while I took apart the organization that killed my father. He helped me do it. He knew the whole time. He helped me find justice for a murder he had helped arrange. He stopped. He said, "And Aldo." She said Aldo found out 3 years after Bruno died. He found his father's own record of it. Rowan found that Aldo knew and has been using that knowledge as leverage ever since. He was quiet for a long time. She did not try to fill the silence. She let it be what it was. Then he said Aldo was still giving him information. She said yes. He said the phone at the meeting. She said I saw it. I was not completely certain until this arrived. He looked at her. He said, "You saw it and you waited." She said, "I needed to be sure. Moving before you understand is how mistakes get made. Someone told me that once." Something moved through his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. The expression of a man who has just lost something he cannot name and is finding in the same moment something else that is also true. He said, "What do I do with this?" She said, "You know what to do. You have always known. The question is whether you can do it without becoming the thing you have been trying not to be." He looked at the page on the table. He said, "Aldo is family." She said, "Aldo made a choice. He had years to make a different one. He chose silence and then he chose Rowan. That is two choices, not one. At some point, a man's choices become the most accurate description of who he is." Luca looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Stay here." He picked up the page and put it in his own pocket and walked out of the restaurant. She stayed. She cleaned the tables that did not need cleaning. She reorganized the bar cart that was already organized. She made a pot of coffee and let it go cold and made a fresh one. An hour later, Luca came back. He sat down at the bar. He looked the way a person looks after a conversation that has ended something. Not destroyed, ended. The specific exhaustion of a door finally closing on a room you will not enter again. He said, "It is done." She poured out the cold coffee and made a fresh pot. He said, "I told him what I know." He did not deny it. He told me about the year he found his father's notes. He told me how Rowan approached him, what he offered and what he threatened. He told me everything. Then I told him to get out of the city and not come back. He said I did not hurt him. She said, "I know." He said, "I wanted to." She said, "I know that too." She set the fresh coffee in front of him and sat across, and they were quiet together in the empty restaurant while the afternoon light moved across the floor toward the door and then past it the way afternoon light moves following its own schedule, indifferent to the weight of the things it illuminates. The days after Aldo left had a particular quality that Kara had not anticipated. She had expected relief. She had expected the atmosphere around Luca to loosen, the way a room feels different after a window is opened and air moves through it that has not moved before. Instead, there was something more complicated, a heaviness that was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to it, the specific weight of a man who has done the right thing and found that doing the right thing does not feel the way he expected, that the rightness of a decision does not neutralize the cost of arriving at it. Luca came to the restaurant every day that week. He sat in the corner with coffee he did not finish and phone calls he kept short, and a stillness that Ginevra watched from the kitchen with the careful attention of a woman who has watched this man since he was a boy and knows the difference between the silences. On Friday, she sent Kara to him with a plate of food he had not ordered. Kara set it down without comment. He looked at it, then he looked at her. He said, "She sent you." Kara said, "She said you forget to eat when you are thinking too hard." She said it has been true since you were 9 years old and she does not expect it to change. He almost smiled. She sat down across from him. He said, "I keep thinking about the years, not just the betrayal, the years before it. Bruno helped me carry my father. He stood in the rain next to me and he grieved, and I believed every part of it was real." She said it may have been real. People are capable of genuinely grieving things they cause. That is one of the more difficult truths about them. The grief does not cancel the act, and the act does not cancel the grief. Both exist. That is worse than either one alone, but it is also more human than a clean story would be. He looked at her. He said, "That is either very wise or very bleak." She said, "It is both." Most true things are. He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the fork and ate. Not because he was hungry, because someone had taken the trouble to feed him, and he understood that refusing it would be a different kind of wrong. She watched the street while he ate and said nothing else, and that was enough. She was thinking about Rowan Voss. She had not stopped thinking about Rowan Voss. With Aldo gone, Rowan had lost his source. He would know this quickly. The kind of man who had built a decade-long operation on information would have systems in place to tell him when a source went silent, and Aldo going silent would read to him as either compromise or extraction. Either way, he would understand that his window was closing. Closing windows made patient men impatient. She said it to Ginevra that evening, after the restaurant closed, standing in the kitchen with the lights low and the dishwasher running. Ginevra listened without interrupting. Then she said, "You think he will move soon?" Kara said, "I think we have days, not weeks." Ginevra said, "What will he do?" Kara said, "He will do what he has always done. He will find the point of greatest leverage and apply pressure there. He knows Luca's operation. He knows the business. He knows the structure. But Aldo has been his primary source on the personal side, on the things that matter more than business to a man like Luca." She paused. She said, "He knows that Luca's real center is this house, this kitchen, you." Ginevra looked at her steadily. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She had lived 68 years inside a world where danger was not hypothetical, and she had learned to look at it directly without looking away. But something moved through her face then. Not fear, something older than fear, the recognition of a woman who has already survived one version of this and understands that surviving it again will cost something different than the first time. She said, "What do we do?" Kara said, "We tell Luca. Tonight." She called him from the kitchen. He arrived in less than 20 minutes and sat at the kitchen table while Kara laid it out. Not with drama, not with qualification, just the logic of it, the timeline, the conclusion. She watched him take it in. She watched his face move through the same sequence she had seen before the assessment, the calculation, and then the thing underneath the calculation that he usually kept where it could not be seen. He said, "I will increase the security on this house. I will have men here around the clock." Kara said, "That is necessary. It is not sufficient." He said, "What else?" She said, "Rowan is not going to come at the house with men. That is not how he operates. He is going to take something and use it as leverage. He needs you to come to him on his terms. Increased security makes this house harder to breach, but it does not change his strategy. It only changes the location where the leverage is applied." Luca was quiet. Then he said, "If he takes someone," he looked at Ginevra. Ginevra said quietly, "Then you go and get me back, like your father would have." He looked at his mother for a long moment. Then he said, "I am not going to let it come to that." She said, "Luca, I have been in this family for 68 years. I have watched men say that sentence, and I have watched what comes after. You cannot always prevent the thing you are most afraid of. Sometimes you can only be ready for it." 3 days later, at 6:40 in the morning, Luca's phone rang. Kara was already at a restaurant when she heard from him. She had arrived early to take delivery of the weekly produce order, and she was in the back checking the crates against the invoice when her phone rang, and she heard something in Luca's voice that she had not heard before. Not panic. Luca was not a man who panicked. But there was a compression in his voice, the sound of a man applying tremendous pressure to himself from the inside to keep his voice doing what he needed it to do. He said, "It is my mother." Kara set down the invoice. He said she went to the early mass. She goes every Tuesday and Friday. She has gone for 40 years. I had men outside the church, but they took her between the church door and the car. It was 40 feet. 40 feet, and they had her in under a minute. He said, "Rowan called me 10 minutes ago." Kara said, "What does he want?" Luca said, "He wants me to bring you. He wants you to translate a document. He says if you translate it and give him what he needs, he will release her unharmed. He says if I come with anyone other than you, he will know and there will be consequences." She was quiet for 3 seconds. She said, "I know what document it is." He said, "Kara." She said, "I am coming. Tell me where." He said her name again, differently this time, with something in it that had no operational purpose at all, something that belonged to a different kind of conversation than the one they were having. She said, "Luca, I am coming. This is not your decision." There was a pause. Then he said, "A warehouse in Red Hook. I will pick you up in 10 minutes. Do not leave the restaurant before I arrive." She said, I will be outside. She went to the front of the restaurant and unlocked the door and stood on the sidewalk in the early morning cold. The street was quiet. A man walked into him. A delivery truck idled at the corner. The city was doing what it always did, moving forward without pausing for the things happening inside it. She thought about the document. She had read about it in Philomena's notes, a record written in the old formal Sicilian legal dialect used by certain families for internal contracts and agreements, a dialect so specific and archaic that it had not been in common use since before the war. It documented agreements made by the Voss organization, agreements that implicated not just Carter Voss, but several men who were still alive, still prominent, still protected by the distance of years, and the assumption that certain things had been buried deep enough to stay buried. If translated and entered into public record, those agreements would destroy careers and open investigations. If translated and given to Rowan Voss, they would give him leverage over every man implicated. A different kind of destruction, but a destruction all the same. A new empire built from old crimes, the same inheritance Rowan had been told not to claim. Kara understood precisely what she was being asked to do, and precisely what refusing would cost, and she had made her decision between the kitchen and the front door of the restaurant, and she was not uncertain about it. Luca pulled up and she got in. He did not speak for the first several blocks. Then he said, "You understand what he is asking?" She said, "Yes." He said, "And you understand that giving it to him is not an option?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Then why are you coming?" She said, "Because your mother is there, and because I am the only person in this situation who has something Rowan Voss cannot plan around." He said, "What is that?" She said, "I speak the language the document is written in. He needs me to read it. That means I am the only person in that room whose cooperation is genuinely required, which means I am the only person in that room with a real choice." He looked at her briefly and then looked back at the road. He said, "Kara." She said, "Drive." The night before, Ginevra had asked Kara to stay after the restaurant closed. She had made tea and sat across from her at the kitchen table, and after a moment of quiet, she had reached into the pocket of her apron and set a ring on the table between them. She said, "I wore this for 31 years. When Enzo died, I took it off because I could not bear the weight of it. I have been waiting to know who to give it to." Kara looked at the ring, a single stone surrounded by smaller ones in a setting that was old enough to have a quality about it that newer things never quite achieve the quality of something that has been worn long enough to become part of the person wearing it. Ginevra said, "I am not giving it to you. I am giving it to Luca to give to you. There is a difference, a small one, but it matters to me." She picked it up and closed it in her palm and stood. She said, "He will ask you soon. He does not know that I know. He thinks he is surprising me." She smiled in the way of a woman who has never once been surprised by her son. She said, "Say yes quickly." He has been thinking about the question for days, and the waiting is making him difficult to be around. Kara had said nothing in return. She had looked at the closed hand and then at Ginevra's face, and understood that this conversation was not about a ring at all. It was about the passing of something. The kind of passing that requires a witness and a willingness to receive. She had nodded once. Ginevra had nodded back. Now in Luca's car, moving through the early morning streets toward Red Hook, Kara held that conversation in her mind, the way you hold something that needs to remain steady while everything around it moves. The warehouse was near the water, the kind of building that had been industrial for 100 years and had the specific character of spaces that have held difficult things for a long time. Luca parked 2 blocks away and spoke briefly into his phone, giving coordinates, giving timing, speaking in the compressed language of men who have run operations before and know how to move parts without naming them aloud. He put the phone away. He said, "I have men positioned. They will not move until I signal them. If there is any indication of immediate danger to my mother, they move regardless of signal." She said, "Understood." He said, "I need you to stay close to me when we go in." She said, "I need to be near your mother. That is more important." He said, "Kara." She looked at him. He said, "I need you to understand something before we go in there." She waited. He said, "What I feel for you is not something I can justify given the circumstances or the timeline or any reasonable measurement of what makes sense. I am aware that it does not make sense. I am aware that saying it now in this car before walking into a building where my mother is being held is possibly the worst timing in the history of human communication." She looked at him. He said, but I have spent 12 years making decisions based entirely on calculation, and I have decided that this is one thing I am not going to calculate. So I am telling you before we go in there, because I want you to know it before anything else happens and not after. She was quiet for a moment. She said, I know. He said, you know. She said, I have known for a while. I was waiting for you to figure out how to say it. Something happened in his face that she had not seen before, not the almost smile, something fuller than that, something that arrived and departed quickly but left a trace the way weather leaves. The air changed after it passes through it. Then he said, let us go get my mother. The warehouse had two visible entrances from the street. Luca took her through a side door that someone had already unlocked, which told her he had resources in position that Rowan did not know about. They moved through a dark corridor that smelled of salt water and old concrete and came out into a large open space lit by industrial lights hung from the ceiling. Ginevra was seated in a chair near the center of the space. She was not bound. She was upright, her hands in her lap, her posture, the posture of a woman who has decided that her dignity is the one thing in the room that belongs entirely to her, and she intends to keep it. When she saw Kara, her eyes moved in a quick assessment, checking for injury, checking for fear-finding. Neither, and something in her face settled. Rowan Voss was standing 10 feet from Ginevra. He had two men with him positioned at the edges of the space. He looked at Luca and then at Kara with the expression of a man who has arranged a situation to his specifications and is watching it arrive on schedule. He said, you came. I was not certain you would bring her. Luca said nothing. Rowan looked at Kara. He said, the document is on the table. I need a full translation. Verbal is sufficient, accurately rendered. When I am satisfied, Signora Severino goes home. He said it with the precise courtesy of a man who has learned that politeness is more unsettling than threat, because it requires the other person to remain civil in response. Kara walked to the table. The document was there 3 pages, the paper old enough to have gone translucent at the folds, the handwriting in the formal Sicilian legal dialect that she had spent weeks in Sicily as a child watching her grandmother read aloud for neighbors too elderly to read it themselves. She looked at it. She understood every word. She stood at the table and she thought about what translation meant. About her mother teaching her that language was the one thing nobody could take from you, which was true and which meant that what you chose to do with it was entirely your own responsibility. She said, before I begin, I want to see Ginevra. I want to speak to her. Rowan gestured permission with the ease of a man who believes he has already won and can afford small concessions. Kara walked to Ginevra and crouched in front of her chair. She looked at the older woman's face. Ginevra looked back at her, steadily cold from the unheated space, but clear present entirely herself, which was the most important thing. Kara leaned forward and put her hand over Ginevra's and spoke very quietly in Sicilian, barely moving her lips the way her grandmother had taught her to speak when a conversation was private and a room was not. She said, when I stand up, move your chair 6 inches to the left. There is a door behind you and to the left. When I give you a signal, I need you to be ready to move toward it quickly. Ginevra's hand turned under hers and squeezed once. Kara stood up. She walked back to the table. She picked up the document and held it at reading height. She read the first 3 lines aloud in English, accurately, deliberately watching Rowan's expression as she did. She watched him lean forward by a fraction. She watched his attention sharpen and fix on the document the way attention fixes when it is receiving exactly what it has been waiting for. She read 4 more lines. Then she stopped. She looked at the document in her hands. She looked at Rowan Voss across the cold space of the warehouse. She said, you spent 10 years for this. He said, I spent 10 years for what it represents. She said, it represents your father. And your father made his choices. This document does not change those choices. It only extends them forward in time. It gives them new ground to damage people who may deserve to be damaged, but not by you, not like this. That is not justice. That is inheritance. The worst kind. Something moved through his face. Not doubt exactly, but the recognition of a person who has heard an argument that reaches something they have not been willing to examine, and who dislikes that feeling with a particular intensity because they have organized years around not having to feel it. She said you were 18 years old when Luca Severino let you leave. You could have used those 10 years to build something that had nothing to do with this room. You chose not to. That choice is yours, but I will not be the instrument of it. Then she tore the document in half. The sound was very loud in the quiet warehouse. Not the tearing itself, which was quick, but what the tearing meant, which filled the space in a way that had nothing to do with volume. Rowan moved. Luca moved faster. The signal had already been given, not a word or a gesture, but the tearing itself, which Luca had told his men to listen for because Kara had told him in the car what she intended to do, and he had been quiet for a long moment, and then said the door to the left of her chair. My men will be at it. The warehouse door came open, and in the 3 seconds of motion that followed, Kara moved toward Ginevra. She reached the chair as Ginevra was already rising from it, already moving with the decisive motion of someone who has been waiting for a signal and has been ready since the moment they heard it, and Kara took her arm and moved her toward the left door, and they went through it into the cold morning air of a Red Hook alley, while the sounds inside the warehouse resolved themselves in the way that such sounds resolve when one side is prepared and the other is not. She stood in the alley with Ginevra and did not let go of her arm. Ginevra was breathing hard, not from fear but from movement, from the body's honest response to urgency. She looked at Kara and her eyes were bright. She said in Sicilian, "You tore it." Kara said yes. Ginevra said your grandmother would have done the same thing. They stood in the alley until Luca came through the door. He came straight to his mother and held her for a long moment without speaking. She let him. She put one hand on the back of his head the way mothers put their hands on the backs of their children's heads when the children are small and frightened, and she kept it there, even though he was 40 years old and not small and had not needed that particular comfort in a very long time. He accepted it the way people accept things they needed years ago and have learned to receive when offered without apology. Then she pulled back and looked at him and said, "You found a good one." He said, "I know." She said, "Do not waste time being careful about it. Your father waited 3 years to tell me, and those were 3 wasted years." He almost laughed, the broken, almost laugh she had come to recognize. He looked over his mother's shoulder at Kara. She looked back at him. He said, "I have to finish it." She said, "I know that." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he turned back to the warehouse. She stayed in the alley with Ginevra. The sounds from the warehouse were brief, and then there was nothing. She did not ask Ginevra to speak, and Ginevra did not offer to. They stood together in the cold Red Hook morning with the smell of the harbor around them and the city beginning its day on the streets beyond the alley, and they were quiet in the particular way of 2 women who understand each other well enough that silence between them is a continuation rather than a gap, a kind of conversation that does not require words. Luca came back. He said, "It is done." He said it plainly as a statement of fact carrying everything that the fact contained. He looked at Kara, and she saw in his face the structural change she had seen before, but something different this time underneath it. Not exhaustion, something that was arriving rather than departing. He reached into his jacket pocket. He held out his hand. In his palm was the ring. She recognized it immediately. A single stone surrounded by smaller ones old enough to carry the people who had worn it before, old enough that its history was part of what it was. He said, "My mother gave me this last night. She gave it to me without my asking, which is the kind of thing my mother does that makes it impossible to argue with her." He looked at her. He said, "I have known you for 3 months. I am aware of what that sounds like. I am aware that it sounds like a man who has made a decision the way men in my world sometimes make decisions quickly and without sufficient information. But I have more information about you than most men accumulate in years. Because the information that matters is not time, it is quality of witness." He said, "I have watched you think. I have watched you be afraid and choose not to be governed by it. I have watched you protect my mother with more intelligence and courage than I had planned for. And I had planned for a great deal. I have watched you speak the language that my father spoke and that I grew up believing was dying, and you have made me understand that it is not dying, that it lives in the people who choose to carry it, and that you have chosen to carry it your whole life at a cost that you have never once mentioned as a cost." He said, "I would like to spend the rest of my life watching you do all of those things, with your permission." She looked at the ring in his hand. She thought about her mother's kitchen on Mulberry Street. She thought about the shoebox of medical debt envelopes under her bed. She thought about the language she had carried since childhood, like something precious and slightly heavy, never sure if anyone else would understand its weight or want to share it. She said yes. He said yes. She said, "I said yes." He put the ring on her finger and she let him, And then she looked at it and it fit slightly loose in the way of things made for someone else's hand that nevertheless belong on yours. She said your mother is going to be insufferable about this. He said she already sent me 3 messages this morning. She laughed, the real laugh, the one she did not manage often, and he watched it happen with an expression she did not have a name for, but which she understood was something being allowed rather than something being performed. They were married 6 weeks later. Not in a church, because finding a church they could agree on would have taken longer than 6 weeks, and Ginevra said she was not waiting until spring. In the garden of the house in Queens, which in late November had gone bare and cold, but which Ginevra had strung with lights the night before, until it looked like something that had been waiting for exactly this occasion, as though the garden itself had known and had been keeping itself ready. There were 11 people present. Family, the word understood in its widest and most honest sense. The people who had earned the word by choosing to use it by showing up in the specific ways that transform a word from a description into a fact. Cara wore a dress that had been her mother's, altered twice since it was made, carried from Palermo to New York in a garment bag that smelled of cedar and something older. She had found it in the back of her closet the week after she got engaged, and she had stood holding it for a long time before she understood that she had always known she would wear it for something like this, and had been keeping it for a day she was not sure would come. Luca stood in the garden in the cold light and watched her come through the back door of the house. His expression when he saw her was the best thing she had ever seen on a human face. The officiant spoke in English. When it was time for the vows, Luca looked at her and said in Sicilian the vows his parents had spoken in the same garden 38 years before. He had memorized them from a recording his mother kept in a box on the bedroom shelf. His voice did not shake. It was the steadiest she had ever heard it, which she understood meant it was costing him the most, that the things we do not allow to shake are the things we are holding most carefully. She responded in the same dialect, in the same words which she had learned from the same recording which Ginevra had played for her 3 times in the kitchen the week before, which meant that without discussing it, they had made the same decision about what kind of promise they were making to each other and what language was capable of holding it. Then there was the sound of a car on the street and footsteps on the side path, and the gate opening, and Ginevra, who had been standing nearest the gate, made a sound that came from somewhere very deep and very old. Filomena Bellini walked through the gate. She was 74 years old, and she had flown from Palermo to New York for the first time in 46 years. She had a coat that was too light for the November cold, and a face that carried its years the way Sicily carries its history without apology, with the particular beauty of things that have been shaped by everything that has happened to them and have not tried to hide the shaping. She walked into the garden and she saw Ginevra and she stopped. They looked at each other across 15 feet of November garden. Nobody spoke. Then Ginevra walked toward her and Filomena walked toward her, and they came together in the middle of the garden and held each other, and the sound Ginevra made was not crying exactly. It was the sound of something that has been held closed for 46 years, finally opening, the sound of a door that has been locked for a very long time, whose key has finally arrived, and Filomena made the same sound back, and they stood like that, while everyone else in the garden became very still and very quiet, because some things are complete in themselves and require only witnesses, and bearing witness to them is the most important thing you can do in the space they occupy. Cara watched her grandmother and felt her mother in the feeling which was the closest she had come to her mother since she died. Not grief but presence, the way the dead are sometimes more present at moments of great joy than at moments of sadness, arriving in the feeling, rather than the absence of it, inhabiting the happiness rather than the loss. Luca was beside her. His hand found hers. He did not say anything. He did not need to. In the weeks that followed, the garden lights came down and the city went into December, and the restaurant filled with the cold weather regulars and the smell of the sauce Ginevra had taught Cara, and which Cara had taught back to Ginevra in a slightly different form, the form her grandmother had passed to her mother, who had passed to her the specific alteration of a recipe that happens when it travels and picks up something from each kitchen. It passes through the way anything does that is carried by people through time. Cara began the class on a Tuesday night. She had arranged it without announcement, a notice in the window of the restaurant, and a card left at the churches in the neighborhood, and a word passed through the regulars, and she had expected perhaps 8 people and had prepared for 12. 23 people arrived. They were old enough, most of them, to have heard the dialect as children, old enough to have grandparents who spoke it in kitchens that smelled like this one over stoves, like this one in the particular hour of late afternoon when the day's work was done and the language came out because it belonged to that hour and no other. Because some languages are kept for the private hours, the hours when you do not have to be the person the world requires you to be. She stood in front of them and looked at their faces and felt the same thing she had felt the first time she answered Luca in his own language in the restaurant on the night everything began. That the language was not dying, that it was waiting, that it had always been waiting for the people who would choose to carry it forward, and that the choosing was itself the preservation, the act of choosing inseparable from the act of keeping alive. She said in Sicilian, and we will begin with something simple. She said, we will begin with bread. She said, my grandmother taught me that you learn a language the way you learn bread. Not by studying it, by making it, by feeling it change in your hands, by understanding that what you are holding is alive and requires your attention and will become something different depending on what you bring to it. She said the first word we will learn tonight is the word for home. And 23 people in a small restaurant in Little Italy in November leaned forward at the same time, and the room went very quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something is beginning, when the people in the room have recognized that what is happening has a weight that deserves their attention and have decided to give it. And Cara Bellini, who had spent 6 years learning how not to be noticed, stood in the center of all that attention and spoke. Luca was in the back at the corner table with coffee. He was not drinking. He had come because he had not been able to stay away, which he was learning to accept as a general condition of his life, now one of the permanent conditions, the kind that arrive quietly and stay. He watched her and he thought about a Friday night in autumn when 4 men had walked into a restaurant and a woman had answered in a language he thought he had lost, and something in him had stopped and reoriented around a direction he had not known he was looking for. He thought about his father and about Bruno and about the weight of betrayal and the longer weight of carrying it. He thought about Aldo somewhere in the country living with what he had done, carrying that weight forward into whatever came next. He thought about Rowan Voss and felt nothing which was different from the nothing he had felt after Carter Voss, which had been a nothing made of effort and discipline and the daily decision to close a door. This was a natural nothing, the nothing of a finished thing, the nothing of an account that has been settled. He thought about his mother in the garden holding Filomena Bellini and the sound she had made. He thought about a ring that fit a little loose and how he had thought about having it sized. And Cara had said, do not, said she wanted to feel it move, said she liked knowing it had belonged to someone else first, that it carried that belonging the way good things carry their history, not as weight but as depth. He watched her teach. She was explaining a vowel sound that most people lost in childhood if they had ever had it at all, demonstrating the placement with a patience that was not performance, but genuine interest in whether the person across from her understood whether the sound was arriving in them the way it was meant to arrive. An old man in the front row, 70, perhaps the kind of face that belonged to a man who had been young in a neighborhood that was younger and harder and more itself, was repeating the sound back to her with the concentration of someone excavating something he had thought was buried too deep to reach. He got it. Something she said made his face change in the way that faces change when something arrives that has been absent for a very long time. Luca watched the face change and felt something in his chest that he would not have been able to name a year ago and which he could name now. Not happiness exactly. Happiness was too simple, too light a word for the thing he was feeling. Something more structural than happiness. The sense of a life reordering itself around something worth ordering itself around. The sense of foundations being laid in ground that he had spent 12 years thinking was too damaged to build on, and finding that the ground had been waiting patient and ready for someone who understood what to lay there. She looked up, then across the room, and found him in the corner. She held his gaze for a moment. She was in the middle of a sentence and she finished it without looking away from him, and then looked back at her student and continued, and he smiled alone at his corner table in a way he had not smiled in longer than he could accurately measure. He thought about what his mother had said at the graveside the afternoon of his father's funeral, when he had been 28 years old and the city was his and felt like a punishment. She had said the measure of a man is not what he builds for himself. It is what he builds for the people who come after. He had spent 12 years understanding that sentence as an obligation, a debt to be paid, a standard to be met, something owed. He understood it now as something else. He understood it as a gift. Outside, the city moved through its December evening without pausing the way cities move, indifferent to the small, significant moments happening inside the buildings. It contains the old men, learning new words for home, the woman teaching them, the man watching her, the ring that fit a little loose on a finger that had found what it was meant to hold. The last word she taught that night was the word for family. She wrote it on the small chalkboard behind her and said it once and then asked the room to say it back. 23 voices said it together. It sounded like something that had been waiting a long time to be said out loud in exactly this room. It sounded like it intended to stay. After class, she stayed to clean up alone the way she always did, moving through the routine of closing with the particular unhurried attention of someone who loves the work they are doing. She stacked the small chalkboard in the corner. She returned the extra chairs to the wall. She turned off the lights in the kitchen one by one. Luca was still at this corner table when she came back out. He had not moved. He had the coffee cup in front of him still untouched, and he was looking at the chalkboard where the words for family was still visible in her handwriting, white against the dark surface holding in the low light of the empty restaurant. She sat down across from him. She said you stayed. He said, I always stay. She said you are going to be at every class, aren't you? He said yes. She said you realize none of those people know who you are. He said, I know. I prefer it that way. She looked at him. This man who had spent 12 years being known by everyone in certain rooms, known in the specific way that people know those they fear, who had built an identity out of being the most recognized presence in any space he entered. Sitting at a corner table in a small restaurant in Little Italy, unknown, unremarkable, drinking coffee. He was not drinking, watching his wife teach old men how to speak the language of their grandparents. She said, is this what you wanted? When you were 28 and you thought about what came next, is this it? He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of an answer, but the arrival of one that is too large to rush. Then he said, I did not know how to want this at 28. I did not have a name for it. I knew what I did not want, which was to end up like my father, and I spent a decade letting that knowledge do the work of wanting. But this. He looked around the empty restaurant at the chairs and the tables and the chalkboard, and the warmth still in the air from 23 people who had been here an hour ago, learning to say the word for home in a language that was theirs and had always been theirs, and which they had been waiting to be given back. He said, this is more than I knew to want. She reached across the table and took his hand. Outside, the city continued its December evening, without them the way it always had, the way it always would. And inside the small restaurant on the street that had been Italian for so long, the asphalt remembered it. Two people sat in the quiet after something important had happened, holding the moment the way you hold something you understand is rare, not squeezing it, not trying to make it last longer than it will last, just present inside it for as long as it is there to be present inside. The chalkboard still held the word. The restaurant still held the warmth. And somewhere in a house 3 blocks away, Ginevra Severino was already planning next Tuesday's menu, because Tuesday was when Kara taught, and when Kara taught, the restaurant needed to smell exactly right, and that required starting the sauce on Monday, and that was simply how things were going to be from now on. Some things once started do not need to be decided again. They just continue.